My name is Victoria Walsh. I'm Head of Public Programmes here. Thank you very much indeed for your patience. I know, like lots of our speakers, lots of you have also struggled here this morning. It's obviously the 21st challenge is travel. But I just want to say a warm welcome, not only to all our speakers and to you, but also to welcome After All back at Tate Britain, and to thank them for proposing to host this and hold this conference here at Tate. The timeliness of this topic of today's conference was clearly indicated by the fact that we could have sold this conference twice over. But I think that's also supported by the fact that a conference that is simultaneously taking place over at the Hayward Deschooling Society was equally in the same position as us, which gives some sense, I think, of the appetite for discussion around the changing role and engagement of art in the social realm. So thank you again to After All. I think today's conference will certainly generate lots of discussion. And without further ado, since we're running late already, you have the biography and details of Charles Esche in your pack, so I'm simply going to hand over to Charles, but to say thank you to him and to Lucy Steeds for their organisation to this point. Thanks very much.
Good morning. Thanks for coming. We were sold out, so I take it it's the problems with the trains. So we had to turn quite a lot of people away, which was quite interesting, actually. Obviously, people are interested in the 90s, which is a question maybe that we'll return to, because we haven't quite sorted it out yet, I think. Before I start my introduction, which will talk a little bit about the context of this conference in the context of other projects that are going on, I would like to make an announcement, or a plea, indeed, for solidarity and support for the Centre for Research in Modern European Philosophy at Middlesex University, and indeed the whole philosophy programmes at Middlesex University. They're currently, due to financial constraints, under threat of closure. The whole philosophy programmes are under threat of closure. For those of you that don't recognise the names, this is professors like Peter Osborne, who's also organised a number of talks here, and is, we feel, at least in After All, one of the, or the department itself is one of the most active and interesting departments in London, if not elsewhere, for philosophical speculation and its relationship to culture. There are various leaflets or photocopies of a petition which you can sign on Facebook or directly online. We, as After All, would like to express our comradeship and solidarity with the Centre and with the philosophy programmes at Middlesex University, and urge you to sign the petition and to do everything that you can to try and support them. I think this is probably the first of many such announcements, particularly if the election goes the way the polls are going. And I think it's worthwhile remembering that there are things at stake in the political, or at least the cultural political field. This might be the first, sadly, of many. I would like to introduce this conference, Art of the Social, exhibition of contemporary art in the 1990s, by talking a little bit about how it came about and the context in which it might be placed. As you know, After All, which is based at Central St Martin's, University of the Arts London, is a publishing and research organisation, and we have organised, indeed we organised a conference here, which I'll talk about, which relates to the question of exhibition histories, which is our project. Now, traditionally, the history of modern art has focused more on the moment of production, the artist in the studio, or the influences from his or her social, financial and political environment, than on the moment when the work was presented to a larger public or combined with other artists' work in group exhibitions. This concentration on the figure of the producer remains unquestionably important, but in the age of mass exhibition attendance, which began, maybe we should remind ourselves, in 1937 with Arte der Kunst and the große Deutsche Ausstellung. This is the moment where the idea of the mass exhibition begins in a directly politicized context, or perhaps we should say an overtly or obviously politicized context, because I think all mass exhibitions are politicized, but the Nazi exhibitions in 1937 were overtly politicized because of the dogmatic expression of ideology. But in the age of mass exhibition attendance and art as a form of popular culture, it seems reductive to understand discoveries in art as exclusively centred on the individual artist and his or her immediate milieu. Art has become a means to communicate and influence thinking beyond the limits of its own field. And even looking back to the period of high modernism, it should be clear that the construction of radical institutions for modern art in New York, in Moscow, in Łódź, in Poland, before 1939, was already evidence that public communication and popular reception or rejection of art always played a part in determining artistic significance. During the periods of the Cold War and commodity globalization, the contemporary art exhibition has grown in importance as a site for artistic production and experiment, both in terms of the discrete artwork and in terms of participative or environmental installations whose purpose is only ever fulfilled in the presence of a member of the public. These trajectories do, of course, beg the question of the power and presence of the exhibition maker, or the curator, who is largely understood to be the mastermind behind the large-scale exhibition. While the role of the curator has gone through many, often problematic metamorphoses since its invention as the keeper of a collection, it seems indisputable that the contemporary group or international exhibition that we now encounter is a direct result of the professionalization and even celebritization, if that's a word, I think it's becoming a word, isn't it? Celebritization of this figure within the economy of art. This fact alone begs the researcher or academic to study the production of the curator as a discrete part of the art system and to seek to understand the kinds of avant-gardist innovations that have been at stake in assembling group exhibitions of diverse artists. I don't only want to lay the emphasis on the curator, because I think many of these projects that we might examine in this course of the Exhibition Histories project, which I'll talk about now, are also led by artists, or by artists as curators, or curators as artists, however we want to place it. But we see that this relationship between the curator and the artist is very blurred, and in fact we might say that there isn't really a vocabulary of distinction that we have for the various roles that might apply to the organising, presenting, mediation, bringing together, juxtaposition, all the things that are at stake in the making of the exhibition. So the exhibition's history project, which is based at After All and includes international partners, including the Academy of Art in Vienna, is an attempt to do this research in a detailed and concrete way based on specific case studies. Our aim is to produce primary research in the form of seminars, such as this, articles, and books. The project and publication series gratefully recognises the broader service of major exhibitions that have recently been undertaken by people such as Althusser. Not Althusser. This has been important for us to build on through critical analysis of a pair of related exhibitions. So the series itself, what we will do is bring together either a pair of exhibitions or a series of shows that demonstrate a particular development. I think one of the definitions we're trying to use for this exhibition histories, for these books that will eventually be published, is that they are moments where exhibitions made things possible that weren't possible before. Now, of course, you can define that idea of possibility relatively broadly, but the idea that an exhibition makes something possible, that it establishes a way of seeing, a way of understanding, a way of bringing together art, indeed a way of perhaps producing art, which makes something possible that simply wasn't available either to the artist or to the critic or to the curator or to the public in general before. So it also allows for a sense of time and the particularity of an exhibition or of a moment of public exchange, because obviously in this moment of going public, in a sense, which an exhibition demonstrates, is a moment of public exchange that we need to flash up for renewed attention. It also permits critical exploration of the intentions of both the curator or curator-artist and collaborating artists, as well as its public results in terms of contemporary reactions and memories recollected today. The intention with each Exhibition Histories book is to look at specific cases as examples of curatorial artistic public interaction and to track the before and after effects of the moment of the exhibition. We will do this through interviews with the protagonists, if they're still alive, extensive photographic research, press digests, as well as a number of commissioned essays from now that will apply a subjective analysis to the exhibition as seen from the distance of the present. The mix between these elements will vary depending on the needs of the individual subject and exhibition and the extent to which archives and documents exist. The first volume in the series will be published in the autumn, and it was determined as a result of our first research seminar held at the Academy of Art in Vienna in 2008. We were joined there by Lucy Lippard, Rachel Weiss, Pavel Pollitt, and the much-missed Charles Harrison to look at the early history and legacy of what we now call conceptual art. As a result, the book, which we will publish, as a result of that seminar, the book will look at two seminal exhibitions that came to define the shift from minimalism to conceptualism, making things possible, I think, in a clear way, in the late 1960s. Indeed, both happened in 1969. The two exhibitions are Op losse Schroeven, which was at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and When Attitudes Become Form in the Kunsthalle Bern in Switzerland. These exhibitions were, at least in retrospect, pivotal in establishing a new kind of art. Indeed, it was often called the new art, a new kind of art in European public consciousness. Though both exhibitions toured to England and Germany, they were actually seen by a relatively small public. So they weren't mass exhibitions in the sense that we understand them today. Their fame spread in the years after the exhibition, the physical event itself, as it became clear that they both offered a radically new way of producing the exhibition and also defining the collaboration between the artist, curator, and institution. It is worth noting that both curators left their respective institutions, that was Kunsthalle Bern and the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam, soon after these exhibitions, and partly the actual narratives are fairly muddy and confused, but partly as a result of curating these exhibitions, and went on to build substantial curatorial careers. Harold Zeeman, who did When Attitudes Became Form, became the sort of prototypical independent curator. And Wim Beren went off first to make an important exhibition, a subsequent version of which we'll actually look at today, called Sonsbeek, Buiten de Perken, it was called at that time, in the 1970s, and then came back eventually to head up the Stedelijk Museum in the 1980s and 90s. Equally, these two exhibitions, introduced a new kind of art, or at least new kinds of materials suitable for the production of art, in ways that established and regulated the expansion of form and environment in the years to come. So again, making things possible, there's also a regulatory framework which is being set up by these exhibitions. So things become possible, but other things don't become possible. It's a moment of public reception. The Public Museum or Kunsthalle became a site in these shows for one of the first times, and fully site in inverted commas, and fully operated the way for, and fully opened the way for projects of institutional critique and site specificity that were abetted by the institutions themselves. And I think that development has a long history subsequently. Some of us have been involved in many cases. Documentation of both exhibitions has been difficult to come by for the general reader, and we are pleased to be able to offer extensive illustrations in the book, or we will be pleased. New interviews with some of the participating artists have also filled out the picture of the exhibitions and given us new insight into how they were organized and their long-term effect on individual practice. In this way, we would like to ground the whole series of exhibition histories on the relation between art practice and its place in the public sphere through the intentions of its presentation formats and the development of its reception over time. Our second conference on the subject of exhibition histories took place here and focused on the remarkably resident year 1989, in which three exhibitions, Magiciens de la Terre, the Third Havana Biennale, and The Other Story, constructed a triangle of post-colonial and perhaps we could say proto-globalist cultural relations that prefigured much of what was to come in the 1990s and 2000s. Much of what was to come, but with some delay, and I think we'll also perhaps mention that today, that this delay is not insignificant. As a consequence of that conference, Magiciens de la Terre and the Havana Biennale will be the subject of the second volume of Exhibition Histories, in which again illustration, interview and argument will be placed side by side. So you see that the building of these publications is based very much or informed very much by the conference that we have here. So having marked 1989, we now come to the subject of this day-long symposium, Art of the Social, and of art exhibitions in the 1990s. This is in part also, this research around the 1990s and the period up to today, in part the task of the parallel research and exhibition project Former West, that have very generously supported this symposium as part of an ongoing collaboration which, after all, in the Former West will have in the years to come. Former West itself is an initiative based in the Netherlands and was initiated by Maria Hlavejova at PAC in Utrecht, and involves an extensive network of researchers, some of whom are with us today. And these people are teasing out the artistic and cultural consequences of the end of real existing communism in 1989, which was one of the significant moments of 1989, not the only one, but one of them, and the development of free market hegemony and how that has affected cultural production in the 20 years since. This symposium aims to contribute to the developing process of so this symposium here aims to contribute, in the context of Former West, to the developing process of understanding what happened in our recent past by focusing on its exhibitions. And indeed, the whole project that we hope to undertake with Former West is related to this question of our interest in exhibitions in this period, relating to wider contexts of production, presentation, cultural politics, as they have unfolded in this period of free market hegemony, we might say, which perhaps arguably ended with the Lehman Brothers in 2008, but we still don't know that yet. Despite having a distance of up to 20 years on this period, particularly the 1990s, it seems to me that the history of the 1990s is still largely to be written. The impact of political collapse and economic expansion, of technology, the media and celebrity culture, of new geographic understandings and globalization in all its various forms, as well as of the relation between the artist and the art system, all remain contentious issues. Yet it is time, it seems to us, certainly in After All, and I hope to you as well, it is time that we look at this period with a little distance and take a breath and address them as the historical phenomenon that they have become, not least in order to address our own time, and I suppose in that I mean on an economic and political sense, the period after the Lehman Brothers collapse, or at least the period that we're now entering, to address this time with new questions and expectations, then ground them always on these questions and expectations which emerged after 1989. Such a project will inevitably be partial. It will exclude as much as it includes and anger those who feel left out. It also has to be said that we are here in this symposium, looking at the 90s, looking exclusively at the United States and the Western province, the United States occupied territory, we could say, if we think about the Cold War as being Soviet and American occupied, the United States occupied territories of Europe. At least through to the mid-1990s, and then slowly thereafter, the impact of the Havana Biennial, Magicien de la Terre, and The Other Story, the approaches that they took, were not yet incorporated into exhibition discourses. And I think this is very interesting. There's this moment in 89 where there's a kind of opening up to the world, and then after 89, in this shock of victory, I think, which the West somehow experiences, this shock of having won without having really had the intention or the knowledge that they'd won in some ways, produces a sort of bounce back, and that it's only slowly that there's a reconsideration of the global, that as it gradually opens up, or the politics of the global, because the economic globalization happens very fast, but the politics and culture of the global slowly opens up in the period, in a later period. There's an interesting delay. At least in this Western European, or United States territory, in this province, which was declared in some ways to be the victor. Having said that, I think it's certainly true that for even this period of the early 1990s, and certainly going back further, the lack of positions from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, and from the Middle East will need to be addressed as we develop our narratives of this period of the last 20 years. Yet, I think we believe that it is in the process of editing and measuring impact and longer-term effect that the stories of the last decades will begin to emerge, be challenged and refined, and slowly move from the status of what might be called a dynamic, still writable archive, which I think we're just at the moment where we turn from a dynamic, writable archive to something which is semi-active. There's these definitions also in archives of a passive, a semi-active, and a dynamic archive, and a semi-active, more settled archive that is the inevitable fate of this period. I am delighted that we will be helped in this rather daunting task of writing this history, but necessary task, by so many distinguished artists and scholars who were present during the events described and who have studied them intensively. The social turn is a combination of words that has been coined by Claire Bishop, one of our speakers today, to describe especially this period in the early mid-90s. And I have to say, I saw the debate yesterday, so it kind of occurred to me that I had to say something about that, because as someone that was brought up in England, I left when the Labour government came in around 1997, but as someone brought up in the part of England that was turned into a wasteland by the last Tory government of the United Kingdom, I cannot help but see this phrase, the social turn, as in some way a response to the then Tory Prime Minister's famous declaration that there was no such thing as society, only individuals and families. While in Europe and the USA, similar forces to those here were at work, in England, the shift from welfare to fend for yourself was sharpest of all the Western European economies. And I do think, I mean, I'm sure we're kind of all of one mind, so this is preaching to the choir here, but I do think that it's worthwhile remembering that period and remembering the idea of there's no such thing as society when we think about our political choices today. In exploring art in relation to the social, it is interesting to keep in mind to what extent artists were trying to rebuild or even heal what the masters of the economy at that time were seeking to destroy, and what this desire might say about the value of the social, economic and artistic, both then and now. Meanwhile, I am delighted to hand over to my colleague, friend and fellow moderator, Stefan Schmidt-Wulffen, who is the rector of the Academy of Art in Vienna, to introduce the first of our wonderful lineup of speakers. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the day.